There's often this kind of misconception that AI is this sort of potential dystopia, right? It's going to ruin everything. And that's one narrative. And there's another narrative where it's going to create utopia and everything's going to be wonderful. I have seen some folks able to show, okay, here are some things that AI can do to increase good in the world.
Welcome to the AI and Scale podcast. This is a show that invites AI practitioners and AI experts to share their experiences, challenges, and AI success stories. These conversations will provide answers to your questions. How do I implement AI successfully and sustainably? How do I make a real impact with AI? Our podcast features real AI solutions and innovations, all of them ready for you to harness, and offer a sneak peek into the future.
Hello everyone, this is AI at Scale podcast by Schneider Electric. I'm very happy to welcome today Emily Reid. Emily is the dynamic leader in AI education and responsible AI, dedicated to promoting diversity and responsible AI frameworks in the tech industry. She is the CEO of AI for All. In this role, she's democratizing pathways to AI careers and creating opportunities for historically excluded AI changemakers. She is passionate about making AI work for humans and not the other way around. Emily was the founding director of education at Girls Who Code. And before Girls Who Code, she was a senior cybersecurity engineer at the Mitre Corporation and has published research in artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. Emily holds a master in computer science from Columbia University and bachelor in mathematics from Tufts University. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you. Thank you, Gosha, so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Emily, when we discuss about artificial intelligence, one of the things when we think about the responsible usage of it is something called bias. And people can define bias in a different ways. I've heard, for example, that in some cases, bias is something that we should expect actually in the model because this is something that is in the data. But then we hear a lot of examples in which actually bias is mentioned as the thing that is causing a usage of the AI becoming a harmful actually usage for the people. So could you explain how do you understand bias, what it is?
Yes, it's a great question. And it's really important for folks to understand because there's often this kind of misconception that, AI systems or technical systems in general are unbiased because, they're not human and they are thinking logically and all those things. But the truth is they're made by humans and humans are biased. And so that bias comes into the AI systems in different ways. So AI bias specifically is when an artificial intelligence system produces an unfair or kind of results based on, usually it was based on the data that it was trained on. It could also be bias coming from the way that it was designed. But this can happen for one of two different reasons. Sometimes it might happen because the data that the system was trained on was not fully representative of different skin colors, different socioeconomic classes, gender. So if depending on the kind of data set that it was trained on, it might provide biased results. The other thing that can happen is that it actually is trained on data that is representative of the real world, but the real world itself is biased, right? So this is something that we talk about a lot in the US, for example, that our prison system is often biased against African Americans, for example. And so if you are using historical data, to train a model, it's actually going to further encode that bias. So in some cases, the bias comes from, it is accurately representing bias we have in the real world. And in some cases, it's just not fully representative of all the groups that the system could affect.
Yes. And what do you think is particularly harmful in people facing AI applications? And what are some of the ways that we can tackle it?
Yes, I think it's a challenging thing to address. And I do believe that we'll never be able to make a perfect system, for example, but that shouldn't stop us from trying to make a better one, right? So that bias will often be baked in, but I think that there are plenty of ways that we can work on reducing it. So one place is that we can have more systems in place during the development of an AI system to actually look at, for example, in the US, we would call this like a protected class. So again, gender, race, socioeconomic status, veteran status, disability status, for example, right? These are all considered protected classes in the US. When you're looking at discrimination cases. So you could have a way to double check, okay, with all of these different types of protected classes, is it performing fairly with folks across those areas? And you can build in tests to look at features that might be producing biased results along those lines. So part of it, I believe, is certainly building this into the engineering process, to the testing process before things are released. But I also believe that a huge part of it is that this should not just be something that is happening really at the end of the engineering cycle, right before you send a product out. I actually think it should be something that is really baked into how we think about AI systems, ideally from the beginning of an engineer's or a machine learning scientist's education. So that's one of the reasons why we have a huge focus on responsible AI at AI for All, is that we think that everyone should be thinking about these types of issues from the beginning, because unfortunately, the way it's kind of traditionally been done is you learn about these technical mechanisms, these algorithms, the mathematics behind it, kind of in a silo or kind of in a vacuum, right? And the truth is that none of this is actually implemented in a silo or in a vacuum. It ends up being implemented in the real world. It ends up being trained on real world data. It ends up having an effect on real human beings. And so our belief is that we should really just be making this part of the education around AI from the very beginning, so that everyone is thinking about it this way.
I see. And I was thinking about it, the fact that especially when we discuss Gen AI use cases, and Gen AI is basically fed with the data existing in the internet. And I thought, like, how bad it is.
Exactly.
It is just capturing a very narrow part of the world. And even if it is some representation of the world, you can find everything in the internet, like, bad things, good things. And this is all being fed to the models that are supposed to help us in writing, in formulating ideas. We can use them in education. So is there any way to go away from this? And maybe fit it with different data. And I see another problem here, and I was wondering what's your position, is how to define the universal values in this case. If we know that, feeding AI with internet is probably not the best case scenario, but even if we were, starting from scratch, how to define the universal values in the context of AI?
Right. Yeah, no, these are really great questions. And yeah, I've heard someone describe it as these large AI systems, particularly these large language models that are behind generative AI. Yes, they only know the version of humanity that we've uploaded to the internet. And as everyone knows, you only need to look at a couple of comment sections on a forum to know that sometimes that's not the best representation of ourselves. And so it's true. And that's actually why a lot of the early systems that tried to work on this got taken down immediately, because there was a famous story of one of the Microsoft Twitter bots that after being, trained with feedback from Twitter, it became racist within a few hours, right? Or within a day, something like that. So it's, the fact that I think particularly because the internet is more anonymous than our day-to-day lives, it unfortunately means that you have more of that, kind of darker side of humanity represented. And so that is the data that a lot of these systems are built upon. So I think in terms of getting away from that, and then I love the question about universal values. I'll take another step back. In addition to the testing process on the engineering side, right, looking at, do we have representative data? Is it diverse? Are we doing really good fairness audits and bias detection? I also think it's really important, for example, to have interdisciplinary teams. So to be able to have ethicists involved, social scientists, right? Folks who are subject matter experts who might not have the technical expertise, but can work alongside a machine learning scientists and engineers who have been trained in responsible AI, but work with folks who have expertise in the area that you're developing something on. So for example, if you're developing an algorithm that's going to be used in healthcare, for example, or in medicine, right? How many kind of doctors or biologists do you have involved to help you make sure that you're not making some huge mistakes? So I think that, that is something that has happened, but I would love to see more of. It's also important that, once it gets out there that there's always going to be mistakes, right? We can't prevent everything. So what does our transparency look like around AI? And transparency is actually not just a kind of policy issue, but it's also a technical issue. It's very, very difficult to be able to explain why some AI systems got the result that they got. And that's a challenging technical issue that folks are working on. But there are also ways we can be more transparent about, what we do know about the AI system that you're using and what it has been trained on, and what, if there are any kind of values that it's been built around, what are those values, right? And just continuing to monitor, we just call it ongoing monitoring, having monitoring systems to catch and correct some of these biases as they come up, because we know that, again, it can't be perfect. Okay. So but to your question about universal values, I think it's a really interesting perspective, because we talk about this a lot within the team, right? Like, what are our values and what are our students' values and what do we want to build around? And I think that, while universal values may not exist per se, right? We may not be able to agree on those. I think that there are ways that as an industry, right, we in AI can kind of have a commitment to approach it with inclusivity, transparency, and accountability, right? And depending on what the context is in which an AI system is used, it could be adapted there. For example, if an AI system is working within a particular community or is affecting a particular community, how are folks in those community involved in the design, right? Are they able to provide real input on how their values that they get to articulate are aligned with the system or not? So I think that including and involving a lot of diverse stakeholders is really, really important. So, not just ethicists, but like a representative from the community to really be able to provide some input on, okay, these are our community's values. This is how we want it to align. There's lots of different ways, in addition to that kind of like continuous adaptation and bias mitigation. There are a number of ways that we can have metrics around fairness, right? And what's fair. I gave the example earlier of the protected classes in the US, because that's a standardized, kind of set of metrics that, every employer in the US needs to know about, right? So that's an easy place for us to pull from but even that, right, is not necessarily being used in the way that it ought to. So I think that there's a lot of, even in places where, we've at least agreed on a legal definition, right, of what discrimination looks like in one country. It doesn't mean that folks are building the systems around it, right?
Yes, exactly, because we are not living in the vacuum, and the same companies are not existing in a vacuum. So we have, for example, corporate social responsibility. We have, compliance towards any kind of legal settlings that we have to follow. So there are a lot of elements that we already agreed on. I think AI is it's not new in here, exactly. So maybe it's not that difficult to think about those universal values. And actually, while you were talking about how important, especially for this human touching use cases, human applications of AI, there are certain elements where we just stop thinking about people for a moment and, speak about buildings, for example. It would be so obvious when you work on a solution for buildings, as we do at Schneider, for example, that you want to include customer perspective, that you are
Right.
building it with a domain expert, right?
Exactly.
So why wouldn't you do this if you are building a system that will be serving recruitment processes to make sure that you include different voices, or the credit assessment tools, that you actually take into consideration different scenarios, different lifestyles, different walks of life of different people, and then you test it. So, coming to that point, what's the mission of the nonprofit that you are heading, and how you're addressing some of these challenges?
Yes, thank you. So AI for All, our mission is to create the next generation of AI change makers that we believe the world needs. So we think that really the way to kind of solve this issue in the future is that we would have ideally a large, diverse, responsibly trained, and empowered new generation of AI leaders who can have influence in the field, be having influence in their, and ideally if early on in their career, but also then become the leaders and become team leads and CEOs and found companies, because those are the folks who really have influence. And so we want to make sure that our students are really kind of setting that example of what an ideal AI workforce would look like from our perspective.
Yeah, that's a great mission. And you said that everyone should be able to have the opportunity to go into AI, and we should also be building AI that can actually work for everyone. And I wanted to go a bit deeper into the topic that you mentioned about the diversity of people who are building AI, because this is one of the sides, one of the important sides of how we are making AI better and probably working better for all of the people. So how do you increase the diversity among AI experts in business? Do you have any recommendations here?
Yeah, it's a great question. So my main approach, and this is exactly what we're working to do at AI for All, is to really expand the talent pipeline going into these roles, right? I think there are things that can be done, at the professional level to make sure that there are fair promotion processes, for example, making sure that there is support for women, for folks who are in these historically marginalized groups, depending on the industry. I think that there are plenty of ways that we can try to increase that, but I often think about what is sort of the root of the problem and how can we really try to solve this over the long term. And I think that one of the main things that we can do to make the biggest difference is to expand that talent pipeline. For a long time, AI in particular was something that you could only go into if you had gone through a PhD program at one of the top universities, in the world. And now that's really changed. I think we can broaden the criteria for what those AI roles are. There are plenty of non-traditional backgrounds or transferable skills that folks can use to get into this field. And so I'm a big believer in really kind of expanding access in that way. But I also believe that a large part of our approach is to make sure that the students have really excellent technical responsible AI skills. And I always like to make that distinction, because responsible AI could be, what we've talked about. How do you assess your models to make sure that there's not bias? But another part of that is actually correcting the bias involves pretty deep level of technical skill to actually execute. Right. So that's the kind of thing that we train our students on. I mentioned transparency and explainability. That's a really tough technical question that we talk about in our program and that folks are working on. Privacy and security, right, is another area where in order to make something responsible, you really do need to have a great level of technical expertise. So that's a big part of what we focus on, is what are those really highly technical responsible AI skills, so that our students are leaving the program with some really, really strong machine learning development skills. But the other part of what we do is to focus on increasing social capital. And I think this is true across the board, right? So being able to expand your network. Do you have a community of folks who can support you when you, say, have a a tough internship, or you're not sure you're going to get through this interview process. We know from plenty of research that having that kind of support network makes an enormous difference. And for some folks, that might not be something that they have really built in. So that's one piece, but then also being able to expand your network and folks that who might be able to refer you for a job, or when a job comes up, they reach out to you because they saw you in this program and thought you were great, right? So being able to have that type of network makes a really big difference. And so that's in part why we've built our program the way we have, is I think it will be really successful. But I think that continues on, right? As you go further into your career, that social capital is very, very important. And in my experience, the more you're getting to higher levels of leadership, it's even more important to have that kind of community and network of folks who are your peers, or maybe are a little bit further on in their career than you are, because, each level has its kind of new set of things that you need to learn. And I think it's really, really critical for folks to have that kind of support.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And, you were the founding director of education at Girls Who Code. And when I was thinking about some of the reasons that are driving away diverse people, and especially it is mentioned for women, from driving away from AI, what's the reason here? And I've heard Reshma Saujani talking about the fact that we are sharing so many bad, horrible stories about bad AI use cases, how it turned out against some particular group, that the fact that we are talking about this and causing a fear, this is something that can drive people away from AI. And so part of the another way to attract people should be to show them how AI can be used for good. Like, would you agree with this? And do you have any examples of how some good AI application was actually attracting more people to join this part of the technical field?
Yes. And by the way, you mentioned Reshma Saujani is a great mentor of mine. I was involved as an advisor with a project that they had at her new organization called Moms First, which is really focused on getting paid family leave passed in the United States and just increasing support for mothers, getting more reasonably priced childcare. And so we worked on an AI tool that they developed and released, and I advised a little bit on. And that was basically to kind of use AI to help parents navigate leave. When I went on leave when my daughter was born about 4 years ago, it was really, really difficult to sort through all the paperwork. And so that to me was a really interesting example of a place where you could use generative AI. And I think that there's a lot out there where folks are really kind of looking at, okay, AI is this sort of potential dystopia, right? It's going to ruin everything and the robots are going to take over, right? And that's one narrative. And there's another narrative where it's going to create utopia and everything's going to be wonderful when we have AGI and it's going to solve all these problems. And I have seen some folks able to show, okay, here are some things that AI can do to increase good in the world, right? One example could be how AI could be used to address climate change. We know, for example, that some of these large language models may actually be contributing to climate change because of the sheer amount of energy it takes to train these models. But there are applications of using some of that AI to address other parts of the challenges. We could also be looking at, there's a lot of interesting work right now in kind of smaller language models and small AI, folks are calling it, right? It might not be as perfect as some of these huge models, but it might be worth something where we're not requiring so much energy to go in to build these systems. So, those are some really interesting cases. These are some of the things that actually some of our students have gravitated to. And I certainly saw this at Girls Who Code as well. To see students who were, when we let them develop their own projects, they might go towards something that they were really interested in, like, a technical system that can help someone if they're, they're feeling lonely. We talk about this a lot in the US, that there's this sort of like loneliness and mental health epidemic among teens, especially, and young adults who have kind of gone through that darker period of the pandemic, that or that social media is contributing to that, right? So there can be other ways that we could build systems to actually, work in conjunction with a lot of the other non-technical tools that we need, but to, maybe be able to flag if, it looks like this person needs some sort of mental health support, right? Or I've seen folks also work on developing projects that can detect, whether, water in a community is clean. That's actually something that one of our early students, Stephanie, worked on for one of our early programs. And so there's lots of different ways we can be applying some of these tools. AI in particular, outside of just generative AI, which obviously creates a lot of efficiency for folks, there's still plenty of really excellent AI systems that can be focused on prediction and modeling and, need anything that really requires looking at patterns and looking at a lot of data at once. We can use AI systems to, really increase the human capacity there. So I think there's a lot of really, really great ways to do that. I do think that it's very important, though, that we not necessarily equate, kind of AI doing good with the folks who might have been left out of the field, like women, folks lower socioeconomic status, racial and ethnic groups that have been left out of the field. I think it's important that we make sure that that's everyone's job to learn how to do AI well and use some of these tools for good. But the way that I have my educational philosophy towards students in this realm is to basically design it as much as possible so that the students are working on problems that they want to solve, right? And often they might be being able to see a lot of different types of examples, whether it be something that we could call AI for good, or just, AI that can make a really successful company and can help you build intergenerational wealth for your community, right? Like there are lots of different ways that we could kind of qualify AI for good. So I think it's important that that's the case for everyone, but definitely have the more that you're providing a lot of different types of examples, the more that you will be likely to attract a number of different folks. And especially if you're letting them kind of bring their own passions and agency into the design.
I see. Yeah, that's, I think, the great message to finish our conversation. So thank you so much for your time and thank you for your engagement and activity within the frame of the nonprofit AI for All. I think we are moving the needle. And this is at least what we see also at Schneider Electric, that many people who join our AI teams, they are happy to work on the applications that are exactly having this meaningful purpose, that are changing something in their local communities, but also changing something at the global scale. So hopefully we will see even more people from different backgrounds investing their time and their expertise into this field. Thank you so much for the conversation, Emily.
Thank you so much, Gosha. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us today on AI at Scale podcast. Be sure to visit our se.com/AI website and learn more about our AI at Scale solutions. Head over to our Schneider blog platform to read more. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your preferred platform and share it with your network. Thank you for listening and stay tuned for the next episode.